It's the Believe in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel. And look, the high of minicamp is over. All those non-padded practices where at least you saw your team with new numbers at times, thanks to Kamari Lassiter and Tank Dell out there, but you can't really tell too much. So these are the things that I'm very much looking forward to the first couple of weeks of training camp, because even though it's still meaningless, even though there's still not actual football games, you can start to tell some things when the pads come on, specifically, obviously, with the offensive and defensive lines. And we don't have a bunch of worries about the defensive line or the defense in general. So I'm going to do the offensive topics first, and then we'll move over onto the defensive side. I'm not leading with the quarterback because, damn it, I can only talk so much quarterback. We'll get to CJ here in a minute. But look, the offensive line has been the focus now for an annoyingly long time. And I think we saw hints that it might be a better operation this year. First, by virtue of the fact that they did improve as an offensive line as the season went along last year. But then you have the additions of Wyatt Teller, Braden Smith, the rookies, and everything that you hope that Cole Popovich in his second year as the offensive line coach can implement. But for everything that they were focusing on doing in the offseason, which was a tougher, more physical rushing attack, a tougher, more physical mindset, you really can't tell a whole lot when you're not going anything close to full or even three-quarters contact, really, without the shoulder pads on. So Keylan Rutledge, and where does he play? Is it at center? Do we start to see Keylan Rutledge get more reps than perhaps Jake Andrews at center with the ones, and how does it look? So the two concerns coming out of OTAs would be, one, that Keylan Rutledge, he didn't always have the best snap. Like the actual snapping of the ball in shotgun isn't going to be as consistent as guys who have a whole lot of reps doing that. It seems like Keylan Rutledge is wired like the kind of guy that he's probably right now, as we speak, or as you watch this, he might be snapping the ball to his wife or something, his father-in-law, his brother, and probably he's going to get a million reps between now and then. But it's still something that you got to work at with somebody in your face at full speed. All of those things we just won't know. But I'm kind of torn because I was in this position as a player. When I was with the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Texans drafted Marcus Stroud in the first round as a defensive tackle, presumably to replace me. So I was kind of like a Jake Andrews in that situation. And I put a big old chip on my shoulder, and I ended up being the starter that year for the entire season. Then the next year I was off to the Houston Texans, and happily ever after. But I think the competition is as real and as productive, hopefully and potentially, as it's been in a long time. We saw last year at left guard, they had two guys competing to play left guard, neither of whom would end up being a factor in the second half of the season. This year, I think between Keylan Rutledge and then Wyatt Teller at left guard, Ed Ingram is almost 100% positive going to be the right guard. But there's some competition there on the interior offensive line, especially at the center position, that I don't think we've had before, and that I think is going to yield a situation where you've got two or three guys as backups, as swing interior offensive linemen or swing tackles that could be competent and viable starters in the NFL. Evan Brown's a guy that's bounced around a lot, but he's been a starter in the NFL. So it's just a much better depth situation, but I want to see it with the pads on. And are they displacing that defensive line? Because we didn't see a lot of displacement in the run game. And I know, look, Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter are who they are, and you're going to see them do some damage in pass protection against any offensive line, whether they're the best or the worst. But in the run game, and especially with no pads, without full contact, they'll have pads on. The Texans' defensive tackles are good, but they're at a disadvantage sometimes, or at least me, from my perspective as a defensive lineman. I always felt like we were a little bit of a disadvantage because you can't anchor down versus double teams, and the offense can kind of just tee off on you. Offensive linemen, if you fact check me on this, will say the exact opposite thing. They'll say they're at a disadvantage, but they're liars. So there's that. So I want to see Keylan Rutledge. In terms of the Texans' offensive line in general and what we can see once the preseason games start, this is what I got excited about. Because a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about how, man, when the Texans face Buffalo and Buffalo's moving to a 3-4 this year, a 3-4 base defense, they're going to see nose tackles, like the guys lined up right on the center for the first time really all season long, because the Texans don't do that a lot unless they change some things up. And then I realized, oh yeah, the preseason games, it's good. All three of their preseason opponents run a base 3-4 defense. So the Chargers, the Raiders, and the Panthers. And look, these days, you don't line up in your base defense nearly as much as you used to. But during training camp, teams tend to line up in their base defenses more because they're trying to get the fundamentals down. They're not going to show a lot of their exotic blitz packages, and you're trying to get younger guys reps. So those centers are going to have a look at those odd fronts. Basically an odd front, you've got to just think of it as usually you've got a nose tackle there. And the Texans don't see that from the Texans defense a whole lot. So they're going to have experience doing that. And I hope guys like Keylan Rutledge and Febechi Wiwu and some of these other guys that don't just need the physical challenge, but sorting the blocks out, how the rules are in pass protection, what the rules are in the run game. They're all different when you're facing an odd front, and they'll have a heavy dose of that. So I hope to see the young guys especially get a full half of work in at least a couple of those games. But the fact that those teams are running a 3-4 is something that actually really works out in our favor. And then as much as we've talked about the physical side of things and in the run game, in those preseason games especially, that's where if Rutledge is if Rutledge is playing at center, that's where we really want to see not just the physical part, but is he sorting things out well? When I was watching Tyler Linderbaum before free agency, and I was talking myself into paying a boatload of money for Tyler Linderbaum, even though he might not necessarily be a perfect scheme fit for what the Texans want to do. One of the things that he does really well, and that makes up for, I know his Pro Football Focus grades aren't great as a pass protector, et cetera, he sorts things out as good veteran centers do. And a lot of times it's a matter of reading those games and those twists and those stunts that you're seeing inside. And you don't have to be incredible one-on-one as a pass blocker, as a center, to be really effective in just kind of sorting things out and being sure everybody's accounted for. And Keylan Rutledge hopefully is that kind of guy that's smart enough to do that as a rookie. Or Jake Andrews rises to the test, or whomever it might be. May the best man win. CJ Stroud, storyline we're going to be watching. So as the Texans, by the way, are plus 1,900 to win the Super Bowl, which is tied with the Eagles. And CJ Stroud is going to have a lot to do with how we feel about how attainable that is at some point there, either in the preseason or the early into the regular season. I think that as far as what I want to see in training camp in those first couple of weeks, continue to build on the pre-snap execution and everything that they improved at and people were gushing about. When you're out there and guys are in pads and it's hot out and guys are tired, that's where, as the quarterback, as the conductor of the orchestra, when you've got pre-snap motion, when you're trying to make checks, all of those things, maybe they've got the crowd noise blaring in from the speakers, that's where your leadership really gets tested. And that heat, even though they don't practice the way they used to and guys aren't as beleaguered and tired and worn out because they really don't do two-a-days anymore. It creates more chaos on the field. The heat, you turn the heat up, and every time it gets up into the upper 90s and God forbid triple digits, people start making mental errors, and it's a lot harder to function without making those mental errors just because guys' legs are sapped and drained. So it really gets tested, especially when they also have to block guys that are going closer to full speed. So everything that they were gushing about with the pre-snap operation, it gets that much tougher with pads on, in the heat, in training camp, guys under pressure, all of that. CJ is responsible for that. You guys know my feeling on it. A lot of the pre-snap stuff, even if the call isn't on the quarterback, it's still on the quarterback to be kind of a disciplinarian, not just a rah-rah leader guy, but the guy that makes sure that guys are dialed in and they're not having false starts and they're not having illegal motions. So we want to see them continue to build on that. And then the other thing is just simply that, look, the Texans defense is really good. Texans defense is likely going to be better than the Texans offense this year. We'll see. Maybe the offense ascends that much, but especially early in camp, at least, that I want to see some deep strikes against that defense. I don't want CJ to be gun shy about throwing a risky ball every now and then, because that's what training camp is for. But as I was kind of catching up on all the other teams around the league, we've seen, we get reports about, Daniel Jones in 7-on-7 having a beautiful pass to Ashton Doolin or whatever that kid's name is, who went up and caught a ball versus Sauce Gardner. And various other reports about guys going against good defenses and having some moments in camp. They got to look, they got to take what the defense gives them. They got to do this, that, the other thing, yada, yada, yada. But I also do want to see them that Nico Collins, if only for his own mental health, still has that ability to go one-on-one versus Derek Stingley and win a few of those reps and be able to enjoy the fruits of that labor. So we saw competence in OTAs, but we didn't necessarily see anything that hinted at a more explosive offense. It's I 100% will give a partial excuse in that you're going against a really good defense, and that defense is not facing any kind of a run threat during OTAs. That's just why I'm willing to be patient and bide my time now. I want to see that happen more frequently during training camp, because no matter who the defense is, somebody's going to get beat every now and then, especially when you guys like Nico Collins and hopefully Tank Dell. I would have thrown Tank Dell in here as something that I want to see, but I feel like that's a given. CJ is plus 5,000 to win the MVP, so 50-1 if you take it that way. And I think this will be fun to watch, especially those first couple weeks of camp. If the offense is able to complete some deep strikes or anything similar to that, it's going to be all over the Texans' social media. You know that. The third to last thing on offense, the fifth thing I want to see, Jaylin Noel. Jaylin Noel and Jaden Higgins both, but I think Jaylin Noel especially, because what I'd love to see in camp is Jaylin Noel catching passes over the middle, on shorter routes, the hitches, all of these things, and then just turning on the afterburners and seeing that speed, that explosiveness that we saw in the Chargers game. I don't care which defense you're going against, slot receivers during training camp usually are way more productive, or I should say often more productive than what they will be during the regular season. And guys like Braxton Miller or other slot receivers that didn't end up doing much, even those guys look really good in camp because of the lack of physicality and a guy coming up trying to Steve Atwater, a slot receiver over the middle. You just don't get it as much. So I think it doesn't have to be that Jaylin Noel is, just completely torching the defense, because that's really, really hard to do. But in a non-contact, not a full contact environment, I just want to see that Noel has that ability to just kind of feel out where the soft spots are in the offense. And that's the guy that maybe we get prematurely excited about. Sometimes you get prematurely excited, like I did about DeAndre Hopkins his rookie year. I remember watching DeAndre Hopkins and thinking, well, that's going to play well in the NFL. And now he got off to a slow start, partly because he just Andre Johnson tells a great story about DeAndre Hopkins, like just sitting in meetings and asking, why don't they just throw the ball up? Why don't you just throw it up and let me go up and get it? There's a little bit of a onboarding that they needed with DeAndre Hopkins early on. But I mean, once he took off, obviously he took off and he became the quarterback proof wide receiver. Every single quarterback he ever played with, he made a better quarterback, except for Brock Osweiler. Somehow Brock Osweiler couldn't figure out a way to get DeAndre Hopkins more involved. A guy that honestly, I think you can just throw, by NFL standards, you can just throw the ball up to him. Brock refused to do it. Brock's going to do things Brock's own way in the National Football League. Last thing on the offense, the sixth thing on the offense is Marlin Klein. And I would have loved to have said that, hey, we can tell some things about Marlin Klein during OTAs, but we barely saw him during OTAs. My impression of Marlin Klein was, man, that's a big kid. And I think they drafted him higher than what a lot of people had projected, partly because I think the Texans and a lot of other teams are starting to evaluate tight ends differently. And they want a guy that can be in line, lined up right next to the offensive tackle and be a part of the run blocking, so the rush attack, but then also be a viable wide receiver, because that's what ends up putting teams in binds. I went back and I watched a few clips from the Patriots game because I'm a glutton for punishment. But the one thing that really jumped out in that game was, man, this jumbo package, bringing in the sixth offensive lineman, it's a it's a really good strategy sometimes for limiting the damage. But the Texans weren't one of those teams that when they brought out that sixth offensive lineman that they were going to impose their will. I think the Patriots, the year they ended up playing the Rams in the Super Bowl, the Patriots were a team that just imposed their will with six offensive linemen. Said, yep, we're going to run the ball and try to stop us. Last year, that's not what it was. And especially when you lose some of the unpredictability to your play calling when you've got a tight end in there who's actually an offensive lineman who isn't much of a receiving threat. With the addition of guys like Marlin Klein, if he can be an NFL blocker, Foster Moreau, who it definitely is an NFL blocker, if Cade Stover progresses, it gives you a lot more options and it gets the defense more unsettled because they don't know whether it's a run tendency or a pass tendency. We've got those tight ends in there. But Marlin Klein, because of his hamstring injury, we just flat out didn't see all that much. So those are the offensive things that I hope to glean some good info in the first 2 weeks of camp, including that first preseason game versus the Chargers. Right after this, we will go to the defensive side of the ball. All right. Defensive side of the ball. Seth, what could you possibly be worried about with the defense? They're pristine. They're immaculate. They could do no wrong. Never stays that way. You never just pick right up where you left off. Sometimes guys that you thought were going to get better get worse, and sometimes guys that you didn't think much of all of a sudden ascend. And there's a lot of young guys right here that we just don't have an idea about when we get past the starters. And that's the really intriguing part for me is what do we see first out of the secondary? If you think about Jaylin Smith might end up having a big role on this team this year if he can be a guy that they trust if any of the starting cornerbacks have to miss any time at all. But Jalen Reed as well, Kamari Ramsey, the draft pick this year, and multiple other guys. It feels like they have more guys that have safety / cornerback versatility this year than they perhaps have had in the past. But that's the thing that I think if you see them kind of being in lockdown mode versus the twos, that's cool. I hope that by Derek Stingley getting a break every now and then, or Kamari Lassiter just taking a break, or somebody's got some leg cramps or something, that we get to see those guys go against the ones. I would love to. This is where it's a double-edged sword because I'd love to see those guys play some really good ball against the ones. But you know immediately what you're going to think and what they're going to write in the headlines. It's like, wow, CJ threw a pick to Jaylin Smith. I don't know if that's a good look going up as you're going to see these cornerbacks you're going to see in the league this year. But I think that it's just essential that you can't depend on the Texans secondary being as healthy as they were this last year. You know, when Jalen Petrie went down, they were able to mix and match their way through that, partly by just playing more base 4-3, getting EJ Speed on the field more often than they had before, just to try to get your best 11 football players out there. But it does handicap them when they're not able to play with their full complement of starters out there. And I would prefer that it not be such a drop-off. So say if Reed Blankenship gets injured this year, has to miss a few games, Jalen Reed as a guy who's a second-year safety now and hopefully learned some good lessons last year, maybe he's the guy that you totally trust to be out there and maybe displaces MJ Stewart or whomever it might be. But the defensive line as well, I think that this is what I keep trying to tell myself. You know, I would say a couple years ago, remember everybody was wondering, how come look, Simmons, the safety is out there. Why don't they go with Simmons? Then he can be a safety. And then, okay, turns out they trust Kalen Bullock. They want to see how Kalen Bullock develops. And I think at defensive end, you don't have a high draft pick right there just this moment. But I think they want to play it out with Dylan Horton and just see exactly where he is during camp. I think Dominic Robinson is a very intriguing guy, and he might be the classic guy that just by virtue of coming to a different scheme and getting a different set of coaching might end up being the best version of him that we've seen in his young career. But I think they're gonna play that out for now, and I'm gonna try to play it out and wait and see what I see in those first couple weeks of camp. And if we're not getting pushed, and if those guys, if they're in versus backups in preseason games and they're not looking menacing, then I'd start agitating for somebody to come in from the outside. But I think they really want to see how those guys have developed, and that's the process for now. So the backups, I mean, on a team that's played exceedingly well on defense. The backups matter because you can't always bank on having some of the luck that you did last year. Probably should have mentioned this guy first, except that it's just a given that I can't wait to see Kaden McDonald out there in pads, because Kaden McDonald, much like Keylan Rutledge, those are two guys that their calling card is their physicality, and it's frustrating as hell when you're in minicamp and you're in OTAs and you're a physical guy and you're not, like Kaden McDonald isn't the fastest guy. He's not as twitchy as Tommy Togiai or some of those other defensive tackles and Sheldon Rankins. And those types of players don't tend to do awesome in non-padded stuff because you take the power element out of it. So Kaden McDonald, what I'd love to see is being caught in a bind where I feel like, all right, well, I feel good about Wyatt Teller, but Kaden McDonald just drove him back 4 yards into the pocket. So I'm worried about Wyatt Teller. Again, just as we talked about earlier with some of the give and take in the matchups, yeah, hopefully Kaden McDonald has some of those moments. Hopefully Wyatt Teller has some of those moments. If there's anything that Will Anderson was excited about when he talked to the media during minicamp, it was that his eyes lit up when he thought about how there's going to be some battles on the offensive line this year. And I think Will's probably gotten bored. He's gotten probably sick and tired of not having battles on the offensive and defensive line. I would look forward to seeing Kaden McDonald have some good moments, but then hopefully also have some welcome to the NFL moments. If he's trying to anchor down on a double team between Wyatt Teller and Ariante Ursary, and they take him for a little bit of a ride, I'm going to say, all right, I feel good about the offense there. I don't know if I would have seen that last year. And likewise, Kaden McDonald just puts a whooping on somebody, one of the better players. I'm going to be excited about seeing that, even though I've seen that before. It can't be that the first 2 weeks we're just wondering, is the offense going to run a successful play today? That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not too much of an exaggeration. It really wasn't until the last couple of days in West Virginia last year that it seemed like the offense was starting to do something, anything, and moving the ball and looked like they had a little clarity. They had Nick Chubb as their lead back at that point, and that's going to be different this year. I think last year watching Nick Chubb, you're watching it through gritted teeth, and you're kind of thinking like, oh, I guess this will work. Still got good vision. He's got strength. And Woody Marks at that point was just a rookie that was impressing me in pass protection, but was still a rookie. And we saw, they first and foremost, I don't want him to get injured, but I think we'll see more out of Woody Marks. I'm veering away from the defensive side of the ball. I apologize. The other thing that I want to see from the defense is really, as we've talked about who's going to replace EJ Speed, I've talked a lot about Wade Wood as the draft pick and Marte Mapu, who the Texans traded for from the Patriots. And D'Amico said some really nice things about Marte Mapu during camp. I did ask him about it, so it wasn't like he just came up unprompted. But one of the big things that he mentioned was just that he's very versatile. He's played multiple different positions. He's played safety, play either Mike or Will linebacker. And I think when it comes to picking up the scheme and doing the things that they want him to do, they traded for him for a reason. It wasn't a boatload of picks whatsoever. It was very late pick swap or something like that. I think they do like his length, and I think they like Wade Wood as his length when it comes to being a linebacker and just being able to show up in passing lanes. You don't have to be brilliant in coverage. You don't have to be able to run step for step with the tight end down the sideline or up the seam necessarily, but you got to be able to use your size to your advantage and get your hands into passing lanes. And Woodaz has a really good knack for that. Mapu is very long. He's like 6'3", 220. He's a big dude. He's one of those almost like a Lonnie Johnson type where you're like, where he almost looks a little too big for his position. Lonnie Johnson obviously looked too big to play cornerback, but I'm thinking about Marte Mapu playing safety. Even by safety standards, he was a big guy. But at linebacker there, he's a real rangy guy. And the question above and beyond, okay, who takes EJ Speed's spot is, might somebody test Toa Toa or push Toa Toa in that competition, which is only going to make Toa Toa better. And maybe one of those guys ends up stepping up and supplanting him. But I think that's a sneaky competitive position right now. Just that Toa Toa, and whether he's just able, and no matter what, maintain that starting position for whatever it's worth, he's going into his final season of his contract. And as of right now, they haven't given him a new one or an extension. So I don't know if that's any indication of how they feel about him. They might be working on it or signing it just as we speak. But there's definitely going to be some healthy competition there at linebacker. So that's where we are with that. That's what I'm counting down the days, and we're still a little over a month away. The 29th is when training camp starts. And sometime between now and then, I expect that Nick is going to make some kind of move that shocks us all, because that's what he does, that at least once an off season. So if you watched all the way to the end, my goodness, subscribe and recommend it to a friend. Leave a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple or wherever else you listen to your podcast. And everybody have a great day.